Okay, so I think we'll make a start now. Thanks so much for joining us for London Open Research Week. As you're aware, these events are taking place during International Open Access Week, the theme of which is It Matters How We Open Knowledge, Building Structural Equity. Today's speakers address this theme specifically in terms of accessibility, which directly engages in the question of who open is actually open to. As it's my last hosting gig of the week, I just want to give a shout out to my fellow organisers of the week's events, David McElroy, Emma Illingworth and Paul Rigg from Birkbeck, Stephen Grace of London South Bank and Kevin Sanders of the University of Greenwich. The format today will have the two presentations, after which we'll open the floor to questions. Feel free to leave questions in the chat box as we go, and you'll also have the opportunity to turn on your mic and ask questions if you wish. As with all of the week's sessions, we will be recording them, and that includes any questions that may be asked at the end. So if you don't consent to being on the recording, just use the chat function for your questions and we'll ensure that they're asked anonymously. You can join the conversation on Twitter with the hashtag LORW, and you can enable live captions for today's event on the Teams desktop app by clicking More Options, which is the button with the 3 dots, and then selecting Turn on Live Captions. So first up, we've got Josie Caplehorne and Liam Green-Hughes with their talk Towards an Accessible and Inclusive Research Support Culture. Josie is currently the Management and Information Systems Manager with Research and Innovation Services at the University of Kent. She leads on the provision of high quality reporting of research and innovation management information and supports research and innovation systems. In her substantive roles with information services, as scholarly communications coordinator and equality, diversity and inclusivity representative, Josie is the University Press Open Access Journal publishing lead and founder of the Scholarly Communication Conference. Her interests include equality and accessibility practices in professional research support services and across the wider research community. Liam Green-Hughes is a library systems developer in information services at the University of Kent. His role includes providing technical support and development for the university's research and data repositories. A big focus of Liam's work over the last few months has been to improve the experience of assistive technology users with the repositories. This has involved researching best practice by attending conferences and following developments in accessibility online. Liam has worked in IT for 20 years for a range of organisations, both in the public and private sectors. His experiences span different sectors, including education, telematics, telecoms, and the media. And outside work, Liam recently decided to try something new and learn how to develop computer games, which sounds pretty cool. So on that, over to you, Josie and Liam.
Thank you.
Right. Okay, can you see the slides?
Yes.
Superb. That's a good start.
Okay, so thank you, Carly, for that wonderful introduction. On our next slide are the wider team that we work with, the research support and scholarly communication support team. We couldn't possibly all be here today to talk about it. It would get a little out of hand, I imagine. So it's just to acknowledge we are very much speaking on behalf of our colleagues. This is very much a collaborative effort. And without that collaborative effort, it's something that just wouldn't be possible. Beyond our team, there are a few people that I think it's worth us thanking as well for their continued expertise, support and advocacy. And that would be Ben Watson and Nick Duncan, who are our accessibility information advisors, Dr. Jennifer Lee on her work around ableism in academia, and Sarah Slow, who is as keen an advocate for this topic as I am. So our gratitude to them as well. So the story so far, and a little bit of background about why we're talking about what we're talking about. So the barriers that we face, that we're talking about today, are faced across the sector. We do speak up about these barriers and advocate for change, but naturally these are big topics and none of them are quick wins. The first one is the open access movement, which really does give us the best way forward in terms of accessibility. But at the moment, it's not a level playing field. Open access has certainly broken down barriers in terms of equality of access. but there isn't the equality of accessible access, which means that there are huge audiences that are not yet able to access state of the art and the most recent research that we're publishing about. Third-party suppliers and third-party materials also present challenges if they are provided by private sector organisations, as they have no legal obligation to provide accessible content. When that content resides in our repositories that we are legally required to make accessible, we are effectively cleaning up a mess created by somebody else, and that might be seen as a slightly controversial stance on things, but we all know that universities are significantly less well funded than, say, big publishing organisations, so that comes with additional challenges. But breaking down these barriers is not just the legal thing to do, it's the right thing for us to do. And even without the law giving us the weight to our argument, we would still be doing this work. It's important to think about not just the impact it has on our workloads, but ultimately about caring about the communities that we serve and the unanticipated and far-reaching consequences that can have. So we have had some change at the university that's come from the top down to work towards a more accessible and inclusive research culture. And on the next slide, you'll see that we have become signatories of the San Francisco Declaration of Research Assessment, or DORA for short, and we are committed to the principles of the Leiden Manifesto. These mean that there is a fairer assessment, a fairer use and assessment of metrics in terms of recruitment, fairly assessing other people's work and how people choose to share their work and assess their own metrics. And there's also changes to UK accessibility legislation, meaning that our websites and the digital content that we produce are becoming more accessible. If we could hop to the next slide, please, Liam. Thank you. So as professional research support managers and administrators, recognising the need for systematic change and being able to make those change are worlds apart. And I'm sure that among the audience here are many of you that will feel the weight of that particular quote. So on the next slide, we pose a question, which is how we can move towards a more accessible and inclusive research support culture. So in this environment, as research managers, administrators, technical developers, we can be agents of change. We can raise awareness and we can break down accessibility barriers one piece at a time to make the culture more inclusive for everybody. So this is where I'm going to hand over to Liam to talk about some of our systems and the work we've done.
Thanks, Josie. So what we've been really covering in this area is 3 of our systems. The first is the Kent Academic Repository, which is the main research repository for our researchers to deposit their journal articles and other research outputs. We've got the Kent Data Repository, where people can deposit data sets, so research can be reproduced or even expanded upon, and all sorts of uses. And we've got the Open Journal system, which is our journal publishing platform. The 3 of these are subtly different. The Kent Academic Repository and the Kent Data Repository are both based on the ePrint software, which many of you will know and has been around for about sort of 20 years. The Open Journal system is outsourced and is run by a university in Canada, I think, but we still have influence over its look and you know, how it's sort of presented and branded, etc. So the Kent Academic Repository has been around for quite a few years now. The Kent Data Repository is a newer initiative. So over that time, obviously, there has been some sort of, you know, technical debts and things incurred. And the sort of issues that we've come across are probably fairly common in any website that you might work on to improve accessibility. Things like keyboard navigation. You know, you should be able to tab across all the elements and it should make some sort of sense. Unfortunately, some of the ordering of things was broken. We had issues with colour contrast, with the ratios between colours not being good enough, which can really cause problems for some people. We had problems with sort of past practices in web development that have persisted, such as using tables for presentation, and that's something that's no longer really sort of favoured anymore. And of course, as I should have mentioned earlier, ePrints is a sort of core software, but we also use a lot of plugins. So we've got the core software, we've got plugins devised by other people, and of course, a major source of our third-party content in the system is PDFs that come from a variety of sources. And PDFs can be in a variety of states. They are capable of being accessible, but unfortunately, they aren't usually. So to go about improving accessibility, we used a sort of variety of approaches. Before I sort of get into any of them, one of the guiding principles was that we wanted the accessibility to improve for people who are not only consuming information on the system, but also creating information on the system. So even though our sort of like many systems, the people who create content is a much smaller audience. It's equally important to make sure everybody can use every aspect of the system and they shouldn't have any problems. So we went in and we used some great tools to really help us. And tools maybe have gone a little bit out of fashion. People sort of think, oh, maybe you should, really test on people. But there are some really, really great accessibility tools out there, and they can help you get rid of a lot of common problems before you actually go near a human being, basically, before you actually sort of, bother anyone with them. And I'd like to mention a few tools here. I'll tweet out some links later this afternoon if people are interested. But one great tool I found was a tool called Andi, A-N-D-I. That was fantastic for checking out keyboard links and the tips you get when you're going across your page. Another one was Colour Contrast Analyzer. I used that one to make subtle changes to the colour schemes used on the page, so they didn't look awfully different, but actually the ratios did improve. So, it's kind of a way of making a small change that makes a big difference. We should also mention things like Lighthouse and Mozilla accessibility tools. Browsers are very, very powerful pieces of software and have built into them a lot of really, really helpful accessibility tools. Things that'll give you a pretty good audit. So those tools will give you a really good sense of common errors that you might be incurring. And often things like Lighthouse will actually even generate you a checklist of things to work your way through and to make sure that you've eliminated those common things that might cause a problem. And another sort of great things about tools as well, I should mention, is for regression testing. So obviously, whenever you make a change to the system, you introduce new functionality, there is always a risk that you will cause bugs and problems later on. So what you can do with these tools is you can redo your accessibility testing every time you make changes, and you can check that nothing new has crept in as a problem, because it is surprisingly easy to throw things out like keyboard tab order. Elsewhere on the tools, I got a great bit of advice from Ben Watson that Josie mentioned earlier, was to download a screen reader and try it. Now, obviously, I am a sighted person, so I don't use a screen reader, but it was still a really great investment of time, because I could go through the screen reader, I could tab through, and I could get a sense of how the screen reader sees the site and make sure that that is tallying with what's actually going on. And sometimes some of the bugs, again, are really, easy to pick up, because if you're tabbing over something and it announces something that isn't on the page, you've got a problem. You can instantly fix that. Really, quite easy to detect. And with the tools, I'd always say, keep a lookout for new ones. People are developing new tools all the time. It's a developing area, and it's keep using them, keep experimenting with them, and see what works for you. So yeah, sorry, I rambled a bit on that one. So I should also say about sort of pride as a developer. This is sort of our professional development. You can do things like, don't regard accessibility as a tick box exercise. You don't just do it. You don't tick it off on your list. It's a continual thing. It's a living subject, and it's something that you'll continually need to work on all the way through the life cycle of your system that you're working on. And that is because the technology changes, accessibility technology is getting better, people change, designs change, things like that. So there's a lot of change that you sort of need to keep up with. And I think as sort of a developer, you just want to implement accessibility into your workflow, just like you would with testing or any sort of other stage. But it's important to try and change that language of like, oh, we've done accessibility now. Let's tick that off, because I think that is a potential pitfall, unfortunately. And I would say also, don't be afraid to make mistakes. Don't be afraid to talk to people. I think this is sort of, there can be a nervousness around accessibility, but the main thing is to get in there and get started. Finally, when you're producing your markup, make sure it's good, clean sort of markup. Learn about HTML5, tokens, and ARIA attributes, because those things will help other software understand your page. Because a lot of the time in accessibility, remember, your accessibility changes on your page are actually being read by another piece of software, not a human being necessarily. It could be a screen reader. So the screen reader needs to be able to make sense of your page. So I think I'll hand over to Josie with the next one.
Okay, thank you, Liam. So this is more about the wider scope of work that we've all been involved in from the ground up. So the team we introduced earlier. So the accessibility statements, which many of you will be familiar with as needing to have been published by September last year, we produced based on data. So we run some exports from our repository, was the largest data export that we took. And it was around 7% of the outputs published between 2018 and 2020, because we have thousands upon thousands of records in our repository, and it would be difficult to test them all. The overall barriers were presented to us through that testing, that sample testing, which means we've been able to make really sensible decisions about what our barriers are, sharing those with the people that it matters to, and then sharing our developments as we progress on those and updating our statements as and when. We've implemented, as part of that, an accessibility request process. We know that the materials held in our repository are woefully inaccessible. That's mainly because we've had the repository for such a long time, and some of the content in there is decades old. So the practices around accessibility just weren't in place. And because, as I alluded to before, it's third-party material and we don't have much control over it. So the process means that somebody can contact us to say, this open item with a full text output on your repository, I need in an accessible format. We double check that because we've had some misunderstanding about what accessibility actually means. And then we work to improve the accessibility of that and test it using systems such as Blackboard Ally to make sure that we had a starting point and a finishing point, and then that actual improvement has been made. It's been a reactive rather than a proactive process. So we've taken the stance of dealing with it at point of need, so that we're prioritising our users that really need that content. And actually, it's provided a really good learning opportunity for us. And then we've improved things along the way and spotted things that we maybe wouldn't have thought about if we'd been very proactive and just decided to get on with fixing all of it. We're also moving on with the thesis accessibility project, which is much more in our future scope, but that's come about as a result of the accessibility request process, the challenges that we did not expect as a result of that, particularly around our students leaving at the end of their studies and it being very, very difficult to get in contact with them again later on to talk about their work and get some meaningful ideas, perhaps around images and data that will really help the accessibility process. And it's not just about the documents we produce and the digital content that we put out there, it's about the events and workshops that we host. So the presentation you're seeing today is 100% accessible, and our events are designed to be so as well. And the inaugural Scholarly Communication Conference was one that we developed to be fully accessible, inclusive and sustainable, which was a quote that was backed up by one of our attendees, which we were thrilled about. But we took a lot of the learnings from our academic community, particularly Jennifer Lee that I mentioned earlier, about truly being inclusive, including around recognition of pronouns, the need for quiet spaces, the need for seating over lunch breaks, which I've been to many conferences in my professional life where I'm expected to stand up for an hour over lunch because there are 3 seats for 100 people, and with a chronic pain condition that can be extremely difficult. Next slide, please, Liam.
So one of the unintended, possibly nice side effects of our recent pandemic and all being sent home has been that conferences have been much more accessible, and I've been able to attend quite a lot of accessibility events over this year because they've all gone online. And it's a bit of a sort of a strange side effect, but it has been very beneficial because suddenly you can get this, you get access to huge amounts of knowledge, and you don't necessarily have to justify travel expenses and accommodation expenses and all those things, which can be difficult, particularly at a time like this. So attending conferences, I think, in this time is a fantastic thing to do if you can. Just keep a lookout for them, and find out from the speakers what you can learn. And there's all sorts of other ways that you could use social media. For example, if you're on Twitter, you can follow lots of people in the accessibility community. They will keep giving you information, pointing you to links for great sites that will help you out. And also Reddit has r/accessibility it's worth subscribing to. If you go on YouTube, there's all sorts of presentations. So to actually get access to this sort of professional development has become probably slightly easier, ironically, in the age of COVID. So I'd urge you to make the most of that. And of course, you've got people's blogs and mailing lists as well. I think JISC have an accessibility one, which is worth subscribing to if you're in higher education. And also, you can follow content online and learn about people's experiences who use assistive technology. There's a great podcast called Blind Guy Travels on Radiotopia. Things like that are great to listen to understand people's position when they're in that situation and the struggles they get, because they're not always very obvious. One that I hadn't thought about that he talked about in this program was body language. He always had the wrong body language, and that could cause problems with his interpersonal communication. Of course, just wasn't aware of that. So watching out for that sort of thing can be actually very educational. And I don't know if you want to add anything to that, Josie.
Yeah, I'd say it's the kind of positive consequences of sharing as well. So I published the blog around the challenges of producing accessible thesis upon request, and Carly got in contact with me as a follow-up with an invitation to talk at this conference. So that's very positive. We've had lots of conversations with external institutions about our accessibility request process and how we've approached that, the challenges we faced. And subsequently, Ben Watson and I have been invited to join the Publishers Association Accessibility Action Group in collaboration with the Royal National Institute for the Blind to advocate for born accessible content from publishers.
So, interestingly, this work does lead to a lot of benefits. It's generally a good thing to do anyway, to be accessible, but it also gives you some benefits for free, I guess, that things such as if you can structure pages with better markup and better structure, they become easier to archive. And there's also things like format shifting you can do. I read a very interesting post recently about someone who likes to download journal articles and then using text-to-speech technology turns them into audio files so they can listen to them while out jogging, which is a fantastic use. Not a traditional accessibility use maybe you think of, but again a fantastic format shifting use, allowing someone to make extra use of that time in the morning and not necessarily be glued to a screen as well, which is great. So, obviously as well, you've got improved maintenance, and yeah, it's something to look out for. I've got a couple of interesting links I can tweet out. I know a lot of people might think, text to speech is pretty horrible, but the technology has improved incredibly over the last few years. You can actually get quite natural sounding speech if you wanted to have something read out. Josie, I don't know if you wanted to add to.
Happy to move on to the next slide.
Yeah. Okay.
The future. So as I've already touched on, our thesis accessibility project will be a future project because of the engagement with stakeholders across the university and the multidisciplinary practices across the different divisions that we have. The needs will be very different, so we need to make sure that we are accounting for those and including them in the conversations before we mandate changes. Repository cover sheets offer an interesting challenge to us. These documents are placed at the beginning of all full text outputs that are deposited to our repository as a form to identify where that output has been sourced from. Say, for example, if someone has Googled for the title and have come across our repository via a Google search, they know they've found it via the University of Kent. And it also gives information around the links that they can access, different URLs, the authors, the name of the document, etc., etc. But they are woefully inaccessible. They are created across two different systems with dependencies on metadata, which by its very nature can be inaccessible. So there are certainly some challenges around that, and I'm sure Liam would be able to talk more about the technical challenges around cover sheets. But I know Liam will pick up on naming conventions, which you are very passionate about.
So naming, yes, this well, maybe this time it's personal, to quote a movie quote, but I have problems with my surname. You might have noticed it's double-barreled, which is not even that rare in this country, but it's quite common that it can't be recorded properly because a lot of systems don't have proper validation rules for names. They say, oh no, you're only allowed A to Z in a surname, which is actually wrong. And there's a lot of things that people believe about surnames that are completely wrong, and that's even before you get on to internationalizing your systems. I've got a Spanish friend who gets very upset because I don't think she's encountered a single system in the UK yet that records her surname use properly, because in Spain they use the mother's surname and father's surname, so they have two surnames that they use. It's a different naming convention to how we use surnames, but our systems often don't handle it. So we're looking at improving our systems to make sure it can handle these different types of names, making sure there aren't sort of hidden validation rules that reject people's names. And if you want to see lots of examples of what I'm talking about, there is a Twitter account called My Name is Valid, and it's full of people complaining about systems that reject their surnames, and it's well worth looking at.
Okay, so to finish up on this slide, we will begin developing templates for our open journal system and our editorial boards for each of our 4 hosted open access journals. This will mean that we'll be depositing born digital accessible open access content, which will be a huge step forward for us. And we are discussing becoming signatories of the Helsinki Initiative on multilingualism in scholarly communication, which communicates the challenges around the English language being used as a marker of excellence in academia, and that we need to be more inclusive across the diversity of languages and the diversity of academics that many of our institutions employ.
And on the technical side, that does lead to some challenges. It's worth having test data in your systems that's in different languages. For example, you might want to check that sorting behaves as you expect with different characters. You might want to check that right to left languages such as Hebrew and Arabic can be displayed properly. And for accessibility, this is something we need to do in the future. Different sections should be marked up with the language code that they're in as well. So it's worth checking out that. It sounds like, you know, you should have too many problems, but I have seen, even in some programming languages, some features that don't work with different languages very well. I saw one programming language that had something that's meant to match every letter in a string, but couldn't cope with a non-English alphabet. So, you know, these are things to look out for and to test, and hopefully we can mitigate. Oh.
Okay, so it can feel like a really long journey, one fraught with challenges, but ultimately it's incredibly worthwhile. It could eventually benefit ourselves in the long run. Our circumstances can change, and hopefully this will make the environment and the culture better for everyone in the long run. The next couple of slides includes links to some resources that you may like to read in your own time, and some forthcoming publications. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much, Josie and Liam. That was fantastic. Definitely recommend keeping up with your blogs. They've been really helpful for me as I start my own journey towards accessibility in our repository. So yeah, definitely recommend that. Do feel free to leave some questions or comments in the chat box, and after our next presentation we can take those. We'll move on now to Sadie Roosa with her talk, Responsibility, Rights and Repositories, Negotiating for Accessibility of Open Access Content. Sadie is the collection strategist for repository services at MIT Libraries. Prior to that, she was the repository and metadata systems manager at WGBH's Media Library and Archives and the American Archive of Public Broadcasting, and she served on the board of Digital Commonwealth. Over to you, Sadie.
Thank you. I'm just gonna share what I think is the right screen. If I make this full screen, will you be able to see it? See that, Carly?
Yeah, I can see that. Fantastic.
Okay, cool. So sorry everybody about that. Okay, so hi, I'm Sadie Roosa, and as Carly said, I'm the collection strategist for Repository Services. I'm going to be talking today about content in our institutional repositories and how work on this should affect agreements that we have with publishers. So at this point, there have been a whole lot of presentations, articles, and conversations about the ways that our current open access practices don't actually make content completely open. A presentation that Josie and Ben Watson gave last year actually really jump-started some of my thinking in this area. So thank you guys for that. And so as a lot of these presentations show, one of the ways that open content isn't fully open is that so much of it can't be meaningfully consumed by all users, especially those that that have print disabilities. So reading papers is the hardest part of research for a blind or low vision researcher, and if papers were more accessible, there would be more blind researchers. The section of the article where I found this quote notably points out that the inaccessibility of journal articles can drastically hinder research progress when a university doesn't can drastically hinder research progress. So for example, when a university doesn't subscribe to a paywalled journal, it's not uncommon for researchers to complain that they need immediate access to the article, and it hinders their research progress to wait the 24 hours to get a copy through interlibrary borrowing programs and whatnot. But I'm sorry, my speaker notes are just like all over the place here. 1 second. Okay, so if that is the case for cited researchers, then imagine coming to an article that is open access, that maybe even someone paid to make open access, and you still have a bunch more hoops to jump through to get a version that you can actually access. And typically you would have to wait longer than the 24 to 48 hours that an interlibrary borrowing program might require. So these hoops that people might have to jump through involve additional costs to themselves, requests to disability offices, but that only even, is applicable if you're associated with an institution that has a disability office and can make those kind of accommodations, requests for family and friends to help you read and understand certain parts of articles, and other just lots and lots of hoops that people might have to jump through. And the same article where this quote came from also talks about how a lot of blind and low vision researchers end up just giving up on a lot of articles and accepting that they can't use them as part of their research. So all of this is to make sure that we're meeting the needs of users with print disabilities, but print disabilities aren't just one thing. They can be physical, perceptual, developmental, cognitive, or learning disabilities, and they can present at birth or be acquired, sometimes only temporarily, later in a person's life. And so for this presentation, when I'm talking about making content more accessible, I'm mostly talking about print-heavy content, often in a PDF, and making it accessible for screen readers and possibly other assistive technology like electronic braille displays. So when I started working on the accessibility of content in specifically focusing on MIT's open access articles collection, I knew that I was going to have to deal with PDFs a lot. But I actually thought that would be a great place to start because I know that there's been a lot of work about making accessible PDFs over time. And I thought that maybe as work in that area was done, new tools were coming out, that the baseline of accessibility of PDFs would just be getting slowly better over time. It turns out I did a sampling of content and across a lot of accessibility features that I was able to kind of automatically check using Adobe Acrobat. Absolutely no improvement on any of those individual features was shown from all the way back to 2009 through 2020. So clearly we have to actually jumpstart some action or things aren't going to actually change. I look at it like this. Someone, or hopefully all of us, will take the responsibility and actually start doing something about this. Either we need the publishers to be making the content accessible, or we need to make sure that there's nothing in our publisher agreements that gets in the way of researchers and libraries doing the work ourselves. And as I'm insisting on this responsibility, I do want to take the time to recognize that making content accessible takes time and resources. The work will always have some manual components, even if a lot of it can be automated. And to automate as much of it as possible, it takes a good deal of effort up front to create systems that support best practices. Also, seriously addressing accessibility issues in scholarly communications could require more radical shifts than we often think about, such as moving completely away from PDFs. And all of that kind of work would really take a lot of time, money, and effort. So because we're talking about accessibility in specifically open research, I think it's important to point out some of the characteristics that are especially prevalent in scholarly works, especially journal articles, since those currently hold such an important spot in the research landscape. And because I'm speaking from MIT, there is a slightly heavy STEM focus on this that I just want to acknowledge. So equations are quite common in MIT research outputs, but they need to be encoded in a specific way for screen readers to be able to read them in a way that someone hearing the output of a screen reader can actually understand what's being described. Figures need good alt text to be able to have any meaning for people using screen readers. Tables, when they are used, need to be configured, need to be encoded properly so that people know what's in, say, which column and which row. And footnotes and endnotes are need to be properly structured to link back and forth. Otherwise, readers reading through a screen reader will just get the content in the footnote or the endnote completely out of context and not know what it's related to. And I do want to point out especially that I think footnotes and endnotes often provide information that is like really crucial to an open research landscape. Things like affiliations of authors, citations, and those can be really necessary for things like reproducibility and collaboration. So instead, like not only would the person not being able to understand the footnote just be slightly confused, they would also be it would be harder for them to participate. So they really would actually have like a lack of parity across research practices as a whole, not just in reading the one article. And also just want to point out, I'm especially interested in cases like the one I have on this slide, which is an equation, which is one accessibility concern, embedded within a table, another accessibility concern. And I think this is just a really good demonstration of how drastically we might need to shift some of our thinking around this, because say you have a system where it generates PDFs and tables are very accessible. If that same system doesn't also handle equations in an accessible way, then the table accessibility doesn't matter in this case because the user still can't use any of the contents in the table. So I was curious about how much of the MIT authored articles are affected by these concerns that I note as like specific to journal articles. And I did a manual review of the same sampling I used earlier. And as you can see from these numbers, all of these are huge things that we really need to be addressing to make our articles and any of our content accessible to people with print disabilities. None of these numbers are under 50%. So just think about how much content is sitting in there and very inaccessible. And especially things like equations and figures are often so crucial in these short little journal articles that if a user can't get any information out of the equation or the figure, then the rest of the article is just very much less useful to them in their research. So there are some tools that do already address some of these issues, especially equations. One of the main things that makes content accessible is structure, which is why things like HTML and EPUBs are often more accessible than PDFs, because PDFs are structure so much around presentation rather than around the content. So for equations specifically, there is already a method for providing that structure, MathML. So it's a markup language for math and scientific content. And then there are some other tools that can kind of take PDFs and other existing scientific content and make it more accessible for screen readers. Almost none of these really focus on PDFs. Some of them can ingest a PDF and convert it into a different file that is more accessible and also reads things like equations that were initially inaccessible better. But I think that really demonstrates that a future that just happens to have PDFs where the equations are accessible is maybe not the future, like the ultimate future we want to be working towards, even if currently we can take existing PDFs and make the equations slightly more accessible in them. And while I'm on this slide, I want to give a shout out to Kartik Sani, who is at Stanford and wrote a great piece in 2014. I got most of the information on this slide from that piece, and it also just really shifted and like jump-started some of my thinking about accessibility, specifically in STEM fields. And one of the common threads that they point out in that piece is that a lot of these tools cost the individual person using them some amount of money, sometimes an inaccessible amount of money, which I will come back to in a bit. Another thing that can require a lot of attention and practice and expertise is writing alt text, especially for data visualizations and other things that are crucial for articles. So I don't really have time or experience enough to give you a good training on that, but there was a really interesting study that just came out of MIT's CSAIL, and I'm shamelessly plugging that on this slide. You can check out the link yourself. And I also don't have that much time to dive into this, but I did want to make sure to note that there's another effort going on that is specifically addressing journal article accessibility for content provided in PDFs. It's called the Paper to HTML Converter. It started out as the SciAlly project, and they're using AI to convert PDFs into structured HTML web pages. So they published an article about their work, which I encourage everyone to read. It's linked here. One thing to note is that they are currently mostly addressing structure and navigation. They haven't addressed equations or tables yet, and they only kind of address figures. But they are working to open source the converter code, and I think that would at that point be a really great opportunity for people to contribute to making more content accessible, since we know it's going to be very, very difficult to make all of the content that exists right now accessible. The next best thing seems like it would be a free, easy to use thing that people could turn articles into somewhat more accessible formats with minimal time and effort on their own. So earlier I pointed out that a lot of the tools needed to convert content into accessible files, especially ones with equations in them, cost money. So essentially, if we don't make accessible copies of our content available to provide a free and easy way for users to make accessible copies themselves, then we're just accepting that paywalls still exist for some users. And that's especially notable because a lot of this content is what we consider open access, and the whole point of open access is no paywalls. So just like with subscription journals or with article processing charges, this exacerbates existing inequalities in the scholarly world. And one of the key values of the repository and Green OA movement is that we're taking on responsibility. We're taking the responsibility of making the content that our communities produce available to everyone. And so we decided we wanted to shift the lens from making sure all the content that exists in the world is available to our communities, and rather start taking all the research outputs from our communities and making sure they're available to everyone in the world. And so basically leaving anyone who's not part of our own individual community to fend for themselves in any way is really against the central values of our movement. And I don't think it's okay in terms of access to subscription content, which seems to be an agreed upon position. And I don't think it's okay in terms of making content accessible. So to increase the possibility of parity in some research practices, we need to make as much of our content immediately available in an accessible format without requiring users to jump through hoops. I know we're not going to make everything accessible right away, not the new stuff that's being generated currently, and certainly not the overwhelming backlog of content that's only available in inaccessible formats. However, if we do the work to make even a few of these legacy pieces available and make them accessible every year, it would be really tragic if those pieces then were only available if people jumped through a bunch of hoops to get them. If people still had to request individual items, they still had to go through a waiting period, they still had to disclose various personal pieces of information, especially if we just have that file sitting there. So why wouldn't we be able to just make everything accessible? Besides resources and that kind of thing in terms of actually doing the work, rights and licensing can also get in the way of this. So just to give context for our local situation at MIT, we collect both author-accepted manuscripts, where we have a non-exclusive license to share based on NROA policy, and we also collect versions of records or publisher versions. And some of those are openly licensed by the publisher, and that's how we can collect them. And some of them we have a special agreement with the publisher to collect and share that version, but we don't necessarily have a license to do anything besides share it in our repository. So based on that, what can we do? So on any of these items, basic accessibility work isn't really risky. If we start with a PDF in our system, then doing an accessibility remediation to get an accessible copy for a specific user on their request, that's fine. However, adding that remediated version to the repository and having it be the main file that's available to anyone downloading it is slightly less strong of like a fair use argument, because we're not necessarily only accommodating people with disabilities if everyone can download that copy. And then if we're talking about really transforming it into a different format or doing other kinds of transformations, then that becomes less strong if we don't have an openly licensed version of it. So as you can tell from the numbers on these slides, MIT currently only has openly licensed, only has like 50% of our content openly licensed. So that's only 50% that we know we can experiment with. And the rest of it, we have some questions about what we can do. So I started thinking it would be great if we could get into a better situation with publishers. I wanted to come up with a strong way to present all of these issues to our negotiations team. And then I realized that the principles that they use in the MIT framework for publisher contracts actually already is very in line with what I wanted to argue for. So my point in terms of this is that these are really strong arguments in general for openness, and that openness is good for accessibility, but also that if we're pushing for these on the terms of openness as we currently conceive it, we should add the importance of accessibility to make arguments for all of these things even stronger. So one of the principles that we have in the framework is paying for value-added services with costs being transparent. So accessibility work, if it was done by the publishers themselves, would be a value-added service. And I think we'd be willing to pay for it as long as the costs were actually being undertaken by the publishers. However, one of the things that concerns me about this route is that some of the most time-consuming parts of accessibility work, like writing alt text and things like that, could very easily be passed on to the authors, and the authors aren't being compensated by the publishers. So we don't want to add to that situation and then end up paying publishers more for work that's being co-opted by our researchers. All of that would kind of just add to, basically, I just don't want this to be a situation where publishers think that they could just charge more for things rather than paying giving us a better service and we pay a fair price for it. So another principle in the framework is increased computational access. Accessibility efforts, especially for screen readers, also have a lot of benefits for computational access. Because if you're talking about computational access with publishers, or even if you're just talking about them internally at your libraries, I don't want you to forget that these two issues go hand in hand, because both of them are more successful with things that are machine readable and structured. So if your library already values one of them, if they already value accessibility or they already value computational access, I think we really have an opportunity to make progress on both of these fronts at the same time. So paying publishers for doing accessibility work is one route, and I told you my qualms with that. I think it could be possible, but we have to be careful. The other route is negotiating a situation where there are no restrictions in publisher agreements to prevent researchers and libraries from doing accessibility work. So the first part of that is rights retention and open licensing. If we have this situation, then what I was talking about earlier, where we maybe do some remediation, but we can't share it to everyone, and people still have to jump through hoops to get it, that issue goes away. It also leaves us less locked into PDFs and lets us do just way more experimentation with ways that could be more efficient, could be more useful, and addresses somewhat the issue that not all people with print disabilities are going to need the same accommodations or want the same accommodations, and they're not all going to want to use the exact same assistive technology. So doing it as this is the one right way to do it isn't necessarily the best way to go forward and the most inclusive way to go forward. And the less rights retention, and the more we retain rights and the more things are openly licensed, the more room we have to really make an inclusive product at the end. So if we have the rights to do all the experimentation and transformations, then the thing we really need is to get our hands on as much of that content as possible. So two other principles in the framework are not requiring authors to waive rights so that we can get as much content into our IRs as possible, and also arguing for directly deposited articles from publishers through automated systems, where that both means that we're getting more content overall and frees up some of our staff time if staff was doing any kind of gathering or mediating of content, so that we can focus on the accessibility of that content or other things that make us able to provide better access to it overall. So before I end, I'd just like to point out a few things that I think repositories are well placed to do. First of all, we can dedicate resources to accessibility remediation of items in our collection, prioritizing ones that folks need access to the most. So we can very clearly state that we offer this service directly on the item page where a user would find the original copy, so that it doesn't feel like an imposition, and it's very clearly a part of the services we offer. It's something we do because it's how we make our content accessible. We could also are best positioned to share multiple versions of a work. I think repositories already have the technological capability in a lot of cases to share multiple versions. And as we're talking about different accessibility needs, this would be a great position in which to do that from. And then lastly, I think we do have more access to source files, which at this point are often a lot more accessible than PDFs. We could improve our collection of source files along with PDFs, or at least be in the place to connect users with the researchers who would have access to those source files, which I think repositories, especially within individual institutions, are best placed to do. So as I wrap up, here are some additional related resources which really impacted my thinking and ideas around this, and references for my slides. And I'm very happy to talk about this in the future, so please reach out. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Sadie. That was excellent. We're close to getting to time, but if you can hang on for a couple of minutes, we will take some questions. So do feel free to pop your hand up if you want to ask your question over the mic, or feel free to pop a question in the comments. Whilst you're having a think about questions, I guess I'll kick off and ask one. So I'm guessing that this can go to all three of you. I'm just wondering if do you think there's a space for policy such as the UKRI open access policy or Plan S in the way that they've imposed repository requirements around metadata? Do we think there's a space for policy to impose conditions for accessibility in repositories as well?
I don't know who wants to take this. I'm happy to talk on it partly, but I think, yeah, I think you're right. It's probably a question for three of us. I think yes, in principle, but I think it's that thing of whose responsibility is it? It can sit in policy, and it can be a policy that universities have to adhere to, and that's fine. But a lot of the systems that institutions use a third party. A lot of them are hosted, so those kinds of requirements might be out of their hands. As I said earlier in our presentation, if they are private sector, they are not mandated by law. So I think we need a change to the law, not just policy around these individual systems, but something that just mandates private sector as well in the UK to follow the practices that they've imposed on the public sector. I think that's the only way forward, really, to make to build that into policies and to have some weight behind it.
Yeah, and I guess sort of Sadie's points around like really pushing publishers to, you know, make articles more accessible at source. Yeah. You know, I guess it's kind of like relevant in some ways in the UK, sort of the negotiations with Elsevier that are ongoing. Mm-hmm. Wondering if, you know, it could be part of, you know, these transformative agreement deals we're negotiating to build in accessibility into those.
Yeah, one of my interests is that, especially if we're talking about publishers and third parties making the content accessible rather than us doing remediation and things, is a lot of that, if we can do it to a born accessible way, is based on updating systems to have better best practices. And if a few people can push publishers or other vendors to do that work, then it's in their best interest to apply it across the board. And it's not like they're going to like pick and choose who uses this system that makes a better product. So if we can get a couple of people to push hard enough and do whatever they need to do to make those changes, then it really like affects everyone across the board and lifts that bar up a higher level.
Mm-hmm. Guess we're getting to time. I don't see any hands up, so I'll ask one more question. So we've probably got quite a few repository administrators and managers on the call. So just wondering how far those type of workers can go in terms of some of the technical implementations you've talked about and some of the tools you've used when you don't perhaps have a developer in-house or a technical expert. So sort of where can repository staff sort of take that? What's the best way in, I guess?
So I think that it's worth familiarizing yourself with the possibilities, because on one level it's a great thing to know what to ask for. And you know, if you're going to your developers with the right questions, I don't know the setup at other institutions, but it's possible developers might be split across, you know, many different systems. They might not sort of specialize in repositories. So, you know, the more knowledgeable you are, the things you know to ask for, and also being able to describe those problems as well. I've been very keen to treat accessibility problems as bugs, as, you know, problems of the system that just the same as if anybody else can't access it. You know, if a person using assistive technology can't view something on the system, you know, that's a bug, and let's treat it that way. And that's a good way to have a conversation around that, I think.
Yeah, it's a really good perspective, actually. That makes a lot of sense. Right, we're at 5 past. Last shout for any questions. If not, then thank you so much to Josie, Liam and Sadie, giving us a lot to think about and hopefully start implementing some of this at our own institutions. Someone's asked, will the recording be emailed out later? Yes, we're recording all the sessions this week, and we will be releasing those all together hopefully early next week, I would have thought, if not before. If you're London-based and interested in forming an open research network, please do join us for tomorrow's session, where we'll have a little bit of an open forum discussing where we might go with that. In the meantime, thanks again everyone attending, and to our speakers today. It was a great session. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Thank you.